Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, everyone. Inshallah, hope you all are doing well. Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh Fahad.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. So, alhamdulillah, we are blessed to be joined by our esteemed guest, Sheikh Fahad Tasleem. Alhamdulillah, a bit before we get into our program, in case you all are wondering what's the new series about, and just some background to offer, inshallah ta'ala. So as you all know, we have our Mistal seminar annually in November. Everywhere it's organized by our youth group in the masjid. And alhamdulillah, it's a highlight. It's the highlight of the year. What ends up happening this year is because of COVID, we're not able to have our annual seminar, and so we're doing a series, inshallah ta'ala, monthly. And we have the theme is fortifying faith. So the idea is to preserve our faith and kind of talk about those topics that are troubling to our faith, those that we struggle in. And first off, we thought to really begin this series, we need to speak about trouble itself, doubt itself, the types of doubts, the sources of doubts, just to have an overview of what we're getting into. And then eventually we'll have other speakers who will talk about topics like evolution, topics like the problem of evil, and other kind of common issues that we all come across. And Sheikh Fahad seems to be really the right man for this topic, inshallah ta'ala. And I'll just read out a bit about him. Many of you may be familiar with the work of IERA, and I believe they're based out of the UK. Is that correct, Sheikh?
Yes, that's right. They're London-based. So
London-based, yes. So they do great work on. Initially, earlier, Sheikh Fahad told me that they were doing just general work on doubts and just kind of intellectually strengthening, our understanding of Islam. And then recently, so IERA has kind of the vision has shifted to Sapience and IERA. So IERA sticks to the more kind of grassroots, basic da'wah, and then Sapience is where the advanced stuff happens. And so Sheikh Fahad is involved with both, mashallah. He is the head of the U.S. outreach for IERA, and he's also a research fellow. That's his position at Sapience Institute. His study is diverse, and his research interests include Quranic studies, da'wah, Islamic and comparative theology, economic history, and Arabic linguistics. And that's very interesting, Sheikh. I need to ask you, with a very diverse research interests. So I want you to tell us a little bit about yourself, without reading your bio, just a little bit about yourself. And
sure. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulil Kareem amma ba'd. So to kind of summarize my interests, they basically revolve around da'wah itself. And I think one of the primary reasons for that is like how I kind of came to Islam, or perhaps let's say came back to Islam, I guess, if that's what you want to say. When I was, at the time when I was growing up, I didn't really come from a very practicing family. It was kind of middle of the line. I mean, we may go for Eid Salah, maybe, right? I spent about 6 years in Alaska, so there wasn't a very big Muslim community there. And so at a certain point, just being kind of marginally, if you want to call it that, practicing, even that, like that sort of categorization isn't really, I don't think that's really that profound. But nevertheless, so when I started my first job after college, I had a manager, and she was Christian, and she was a really nice lady, but she kept on, encouraging me to consider Christianity. She's like, Fahad, you have to, you have to come to the way of Jesus, right? Jesus loves you. And so I remember thinking, and she's like, Jesus, he's God, he's the son of God, and all these things. And I remember thinking, I was like, I don't know much about Islam, but I know that's, I'm not sure where she's going with that, right? So it just so happens at the time I was living in the tri-state area, Maryland, Virginia, DC. I guess you guys have a different tri-state. There's certain other, New Jersey, Philadelphia, whatever. But from my perspective, we call that the tri-state. And at the time, there was a satellite branch of the Imam Ibn Saud University there. And they had a mahad which taught Arabic for 2 years, and you get a full-fledged degree. And many of the mashayikh that were there would be teaching in that area. So I happened to happened to benefit from some of the durus because I needed to know, all right, so what is Islam all about? One of the people I benefited from was Sheikh Jafar Idris, who, if you know anything about his background, he's very solid in theology and also understanding like modern issues. So he has a PhD in philosophy as well. So in those early days, because now we're talking, I want to say 15, no, I want to say maybe 20 years ago, right? So now I'm dating myself. So about 20 years ago, at that time, a lot of the issues that we speak about today, Sheikh Jafar was thinking about those things at the time, right? So understanding the philosophy of science, for instance, as opposed to just studying the subject and taking everything that you learn within academia. So long story short, that's kind of how my journey started. She was making dawah to me, my manager, and that's basically how I got interested in dawah specifically, and that's where the starting point was.
Yeah, mashallah, mashallah. So I know you studied. So you spoke about this satellite branch, and then there's Georgetown on your there's kind of all over the place.
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah, I think mashallah it all worked out well, and inshallah you're happy for the ummah, inshallah.
Yeah.
So I know this particular topic for our viewers. Sheikh Fahad has been speaking about this for a while. As a matter of fact, he told me about his he has a whole intensive at Institute.
Yep.
I believe along with brother Ustad Hamzah Imtiaz, and
so there's so the course is called No Doubt.
No Doubt.
And it's 10 steps to kind of clarify or deal with your doubts, right? And this is an 8-week course. I think we'll be doing week 7 this coming Wednesday, and then week 8 the Wednesday after that. All of the material that we have is all online for free. So if you go to sapiens.org, you can, I think it's sapiens.org/no doubt, if I'm not mistaken. You'll find all the videos that we've done, the classes that we present so far, along with the downloadable PDFs covering each step, right? And I'd highly encourage that if this is a topic that you're interested in, then definitely, check it out. I'm going to do my shameless plug now and say, go to sapiensinstitute.org. No doubt.
We'll make sure to link it up, inshallah,
inshallah. Absolutely.
So I spoke with Sheikh Fahad, and this is basically, in essence, a 40-minute summary of that course. So it's 40 minutes a summary of that, you can say, so you'll get a taste, inshallah. So Sheikh, just to start off, kind of, if you can just start us off with what exactly are doubts? How do we define doubts? And a very basic categorization of doubts.
Sure. So one of the things we want to understand is when we talk about doubts from the Islamic framework, right? The word for doubts, or at least sometimes translated as doubts, are shubuhat, right? Shubha. And the term itself linguistically, it means basically when things are similar, or you can say consimilar. So the trilateral root shin ba ha comes from things that are similar. So just to give an example, if you remember the story of Musa alayhi salam when he tells Bani Israel in Surah Al-Baqarah, when he says, Inna Allah ya'murukum an tadhbahu baqara, that Allah has ordered you to slaughter the cow. Now, what did Bani Israel say? Did they say, Sami'na wa ta'na? Like, okay, we hear and we obey? No, they went into a whole line of questioning, right? And at a certain point, they say all of these cows, tashabaha alayna. They're so similar, we can't tell one from the other, right? And they use that same root, right? Shin baha. And when we talk about doubts, we're talking about certain things that resemble the truth, but they're similar, so you can't tell one from the other. And so therefore, in order to clarify what is the truth and what is not the truth, there are certain means by which you go about doing that, right? And so that's what we're talking about. When we talk about doubts, those things that cause you to have basically doubts where you don't understand, where you're not certain about certain elements within your faith. But the reason for that lack of certainty is actually twofold, and it has to do with both one's rationality and one's spirituality. It's a combination of both, and we can get into that a little while later. But what we understand from the term doubts is that these are things that are similar to the truth, and so therefore it's difficult to sometimes tell what is true and what is not true. And this kind of leads to a lack of certainty within the Islamic fundamentals itself. And by the way, when it comes to things that take us away from Islam and things that take us away from Allah, etc., scholars categorize these into two types of two elements. You can say one are shubuhat, the doubts, the intellectual doubts, and then you have shahwat, which are your desires. So on one hand, there are certain, let's say, cognitive ideas that come about that cause you to go away from your faith because they cause a type of intellectual doubt. But then you have certain desires, right? Your desire to whatever it is, not do the things that Allah has asked you to do that may cause you to go away from Islam. And that's a different dynamic altogether. So dealing with those issues, the shahwat, the desires, is a bit more, in my opinion, is a bit more challenging. So,
right. So, Sheikh, how would you categorize kind of so speaking more practically speaking, because I'm sure you deal with a lot of cases, with the people coming to you, especially American Muslims, how would you categorize their doubts if you were to kind of do that?
So, just the number of people that I've met, I think a good categorization, because I've met a lot of people with a wide variety of doubts. There was a paper early on in Yaqeen Institute's history, you can say, one of their first papers, where they studied the idea of doubts. And the classification that they do, I think, is right on point. So basically, they classify it into three broad areas. So one would be what you might call moral or social doubts, right? So moral doubts having to do something like, well, why is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forbidden homosexuality? Just to be blunt, right? So this becomes now a kind of a moral issue where someone has a type of cognitive dissonance, like say, okay, well, wait a minute, if this is morally okay because society dictates it's okay, well, why does Islam say it's not okay, right? So there may be kind of a moral disconnect there, right? Moral and social, including within that category, maybe elements from the Sira as well. So one of the most popular ones is the age of Aisha, radiallahu anha, right? The fact that the Prophet ﷺ, from our sources, we know, from Sahih al-Bukhari, we know that she was married at 6 and the marriage was consummated at 9. So again, in the current framework that we find ourselves in based on our society and our moral framework, how do we reconcile that with our own moral intuition? So that's our first kind of broad category, moral and social concerns. The second category that they classify these doubts into are philosophical and scientific concerns, right? So a lot of your broad-based isms, so your atheism, feminism, postmodernism, all of these philosophical doubts, and you might want to add to that scientism as well, right? So someone may come and say, look, the Quran talks about certain things that we understand within a certain scientific endeavor, and our scientific conclusions contradict what the Quran says. So then how can we now reconcile this, right? Someone may go to their geology professor and say, look, the Quran says, wal jibal awtada, the mountains are like pegs. And the geology professor tells them that, hey, in fact, that's not what current findings tell us. In fact, we have our current findings tell us that mountains are more based on tectonic plates. And that's how we explain earthquakes and things like that. So clearly, your ancient book is wrong. Now, this, again, could lead a person into those kind of doubts. And so those are your philosophical and scientific doubts. And the third category they talk about are your what you would call your personal trauma. So perhaps there was something that you that you experienced in your life and that caused you to move away from Islam, right? That could be, let's say, something negative happens in your life. You lose a certain amount of money. And you'd ask, like, why would God do this to me? You lose a loved one, right? Let's say they die of cancer or whatever it might be. And so then the issues that arise from this are like, why would Allah do this to me, right? Like, if Allah is all good, maybe the problem of evil can be put in this category as well. So those sort of personal experiences you may have. Sometimes those personal experiences are you run across someone who's apparently religious, and just from an experience you've had with them, that moves you away from Islam, right? So I remember some time ago there was a new Muslim I'd taken him to the masjid, because with Aira we deal with new Muslims and their tarbiyah and all of that, and we're trying to make them more practicing. So I took this gentleman, he had just become Muslim. I took him to the masjid, and I remember there was an older, as we say in our Desi circles, an older uncle, right? And he came to him and he started basically berating him because he was wearing shorts. Now, mind you, his shorts were actually below the knees. So, yani, shadran, like they're actually okay, you know? Anyway, so
Even
he
from
started rating, saying like, how dare, oh,
so
sorry?
even from a strictly fiqh perspective, there's no
Right. There's no sort of, so he's berating him and telling him like, how dare you come to the masjid dressed like that and this and that. And so I approached the uncle, and, you know, this new brother was just there. And I told him, I said, uncle, you know, he just became Muslim. Now, in my mind, I'm thinking that, you know, our dear uncle, may Allah, you know, may Allah guide him, and you know, and I would think that that would be enough for him to say, okay, you know what, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that you just came into Islam, so maybe you don't know. In fact, he went, you know, to even he went even more ballistic. He says, you wouldn't go to church dressed like that. You know, so basically after that, I'm doing a lot of damage control, and I'm like, look, you know, these aren't who the Muslims are. But you can imagine that someone, if they have that experience with someone who's practicing, that could be a means for them to move away from Islam, right? So, and by and large, I think that these this is a good categorization of how we understand doubts and how we understand people experiencing doubts. So,
yeah, I think especially with the last one, I think the personal and trauma, and I know, you know, I was reading from Ustad Hamzah Imtiaz, and he how he commented that in his experience, the majority of people he dealt with at the kind of either the doubt itself or the source of that doubt was something personal. And obviously that emotionally and that's actually the worst out of all of them, he said, because it eventually what it does is that it just takes you away from Islam. So you'll stop coming to the masjid, you'll stop wanting to engage. So those are that. Now, so that's kind of a broad classification. Now, in the coming series, you know, we'll be focusing on different of these. What would you say are kind of the prime examples of each of these categories? What really stand out when it comes to these broad categories?
Oh man, there's quite a few actually. So I wish I could just say, here's a list of 10 and you got these 10, you're good to go. Yeah. So just off the top of my head, I mean, I guess most recently with some of the cases that I'm dealing with, because I do speak to, you know, and I don't want to say that this is just an issue with the youth, right? Because sometimes we like to classify this is an issue with the youth because of modernity. I've actually dealt with people who are much older than me, in fact, and we had to have those discussions as well. So some of the issues that arise would, like, one area would be atheism itself, right? So a lot of times you'd have people that would, you know, because of the proliferation of social media, they're going to be going online, and a lot of the shubuhat, or the doubts that are being perpetuated by, you know, people of, you know, who happen to be atheists, and from one perspective, what we call neo-atheist, or, you know, militant atheist from one perspective, that they're perpetuating certain doubts. Those doubts are the ones that you see quite often, right? And that could be, again, going back to our categorization, you have the philosophical and scientific doubts, for instance. Okay? So the example that I gave related to the Quran. Right. So one of the issues that arose that we kind of came to a conclusion with was the idea of scientific miracles in the Quran.
Right.
All right. Now, what we realized is that during a certain, you know, when we look at kind of our you know, kind of a chronology of the Islamic dawah in the modern age, right? You find that, you know, you have certain people that were pushing this idea of scientific miracles in the Quran. Right?
Especially a couple of decades ago, it was
right. And it was and even to this day, I mean, subhanAllah, you have certain Islamic schools that will be teaching this as part of their curriculum, which, you know, and this, what we found was that this is actually part of the problem. And so we started to unravel that by looking at the philosophy of science itself and saying, look, when you look at the philosophy of science, what we understand is that science is a mutable endeavor. All right. Like, there's certain limitations that science has. It's limited by observation, for instance. You cannot assume that you have the entire gamut of observation. It could be that your scope of observation could expand in the future. You could have tools that are more that could allow you to observe more, right? And so scientific conclusions can change. There is a level of certainty with science that, let's say, could be very high, up to 99.9999% high, but you can never get to absolute certainty with science. And one of the beauties of science is that you're always discovering new things. And this is something that if you ask, you know, people who are part of the, you know, medical practitioners, they'll tell you when it comes to drugs and things like that, and pharmaceuticals, that there's always testing, there's always new things that can be discovered, right? And that's across the board with the physical sciences. The issue that arises is when we talk about the Quran having scientific miracles, we're saying that this mutable endeavor called science, right, with all of its philosophical underpinnings, it's mutable. We're going to compare that to the Quran, which is solid, which is absolute.
Right.
Now, we understand that this is a problem in methodology. So if you're comparing something that's changeable to something that is absolute, and you're saying we're going to prove that this is true by way of this mutable endeavor, it becomes a methodological problem, right? Which has led to a lot of damage. And so a lot of that damage we have to kind of now go back and undo by way of teaching what is the Quran exactly? Why do we think the Quran is absolute? And then what is science, and what is the philosophy of science? So a lot of people, when they study science, whatever sort of area you study, whether that's physical sciences or social sciences, whether you're studying, physics, or whether you're studying economics and psychology, all of those have philosophical underpinnings. All of those have philosophical bases, which if you do not understand, you're going to be kind of placed in a worldview and then assume that worldview to be true. And then that can lead to a certain number of problems. So that's kind of one area that I think is a bit problematic. Another area, off the top of my head, is the area of gender fluidity. All right. Now, this is kind of a new one that we've seen a lot of people. They say, okay, well, that there shouldn't be anything wrong with being transgender. Like, you can pick your own gender, right? Now, right off the bat, it to someone, I tell people, like, if you had aliens that came and actually, observed this phenomena, they would be a bit confused, right? And so now this gets into it doesn't necessarily get into some sort of a scientific issue, but it gets into more of a moral issue, right? Like, if I was born and I believe that I'm a woman, and yet I'm in a man's body, then why would God do that? And why don't I have the right then to act upon that and be an actual woman, right? And so now this leads to certain areas of how do we understand the world that we live in? One of the things that I think is really important when it comes to issues like this, when it comes to issues like homosexuality, whatever it might be, is that there is no, and this is probably, if there's gonna be a take-home point from tonight, this would be it. There is no worldview, there is no philosophy, there is no perspective that is free of assumptions. Okay, because sometimes we think atheism, there's no assumptions, or science, there's no assumptions. Any single area of thought is going to have assumptions, things that you assume that you cannot prove. Okay, so when we talk about science, sometimes people say, okay, well, science itself, you can basically, is it scientific? And so therefore, I'm only going to believe it if you can scientifically prove it. All right. The issue that arises, though, is that even science has assumptions. For instance, science assumes that nature is uniform. In other words, if I have this water bottle and I drop it, I'm going to assume it's going to fall because of gravity. I don't know that until I actually drop it, right? Now, you can say that's a safe assumption, but you don't absolutely know that until you actually drop the bottle. Now, that is an assumption that you cannot prove, that nature is uniform, right? And you must assume it, because if you assume the opposite, then you can say all sorts of things, right? You can say, that one day you can combine hydrogen and oxygen and you'll get water, and the next day you'll combine hydrogen and oxygen and you'll get Kool-Aid, right? So, but that assumption is not provable. Any system of thought has to have assumptions, and we call these assumptions first principles or basic beliefs, right? And so what we say is that there's no theorem that is infinitely defendable. You can't say because this to infinity, right? So when we talk about any system of thought, whether you talk about science, whether you talk about mathematics, any system of thought has to have first principles. The first principle when we talk about Islam is what we call the fitrah, right? And so, we can expound upon that more, but it's really important for us to understand you cannot prove every single thing rationally, right? No matter what your worldview is, whether it's atheism, whether it's postmodernism, feminism, There will always be assumptions that are not provable, but you have to accept in order to move forward.
Right.
Yeah.
So just on that, what I'd like to ask you from that is that why do people have such a difficult time understanding that there are first principles or kind of rules that simply are not not challenged? They're simply in place. Or other things is understood, but why is it so difficult with science to have that view? Why is that something that's hidden for most people until you kind of break it down to them?
I think it's hidden because, to be honest, I think there's been a proactive societal push to make that be true, all right, or push that to be true. And the reason is, at least I think, and again, I'm not using this any sort of conclusive proof, but just based on kind of my experience, if you don't believe that to be true, and you believe that, okay, there are things that you have to assume and then move forward, then the supremacy of science kind of, it's degraded in your eyes, right? Or the supremacy of whatever field you're in. So if you think, okay, atheism, if you say, okay, atheism has first principles, has things that you cannot prove, well, then atheism doesn't seem as much as a competitor to other religions, let's say.
Right.
Similarly with feminism, if your worldview is feminism, once you make the assumption that, or once you admit that there are first principles, then you're admitting that there are certain things that you can't prove.
Right.
And again, the issue that arises is that this becomes a problem in your stability when you look at the world.
Right.
One of the main issues that we have today, and we saw this play out in the recent election, right? Is that what information do you trust, right? With the sheer just, plethora of information that's out there, right? It's very difficult to take in all of that information that's just at everyone's fingertips and then interpret it.
Right.
And so what happens is, as human beings, we need certain heuristics, certain shortcuts that we can take this information and put it in a box, and based on our worldview, interpret that information. So if you're coming from a perspective to say, well, those conservatives, they don't believe in giving rights to African Americans. Right. That's a certain box that you've put everyone who's conservative into, right? However, there are certain exceptions to that. If you're if you're someone, so coming from a liberal framework, as a conservative, you might look at someone who's liberal and says, okay, well, they basically believe in having a free society that's free of any sort of morals, that they're just free. Right. Again, my point in mentioning this is that with all of that information that's out there, you have to form certain tools by which to understand the world, right? One of the blessings of Islam is that you have a worldview that is certain, that is sound, right? That combines not only rationality, but also spirituality. And that really is, when you combine both of these are the things that lead you to yaqeen, that lead you to certainty. Okay. I'll just mention kind of to expound upon this just real quick. When I was talking about any system of thought, like no theorem is infinitely defendable. If you say that I can use my rationality to prove anything, what you're saying is that then you're going to be doubting things, right? So you say, okay, well, how do I know X? Well, I don't know X unless I can prove it. So that's a doubt. All right, now that I prove it, how do I prove the proof? Oh, well, there's another doubt. Now, if you say that I'm going to use doubt as my worldview, that becomes a problem as well, because you cannot doubt things ad infinitum. And the example that I give a lot when I speak about this, I said, imagine my son, he comes into the kitchen and he takes out the knife, right? And I say, Abdurrahman, put the knife back. He says, why? I said, well, because it's sharp and it'll cut you. He says, why? I said, well, because it's sharp. He says, why? I said, because that's how they manufacture it. He says, why? I said, well, because knives need to be sharp to cut fruit and things. He says, why? I said, well, because there's a better utility when it comes to eating fruit. He says, why? At a certain point, I'm just going to be like, because I'm your dad and I said so, right? Like, you cannot go ad infinitum when it comes to this question of why. So you cannot say, you have to have a stopping point. And what's interesting is that stopping point, you cannot prove. You have to just accept, right? So you can't say, I'm going to doubt everything. Because if you say, I'm going to doubt everything and ask why infinitely, you have to then doubt your doubt.
Right.
Which leaves you intellectually parallel. You have nowhere to go. So there are first principles that
Right.
are outside of rationality that you have to accept in order to move forward, in order to have a stable worldview. All right. From the Islamic framework, we say that our first principle is the fitrah. And now, what is the fitrah? It's the natural base state that Allah has created us upon, right? Fitrat Allahi allati fatra nas alayha, right? That it is that fitrah, that state, that natural state, that primordial state that Allah has created us upon. Now, what are some of the elements that are in the fitrah? Number one, you have logical principles. All right. A lot of people don't think about this, but if I told you, let's say I said, Sheikh Hamza, the thing is, I want to admit something to you. I'm a married bachelor.
Right.
Now, Sheikh Hamza would say, what are you talking about, man? like I get the whole idea of 4 wives and all of that, but that still doesn't make any sense, even if you take and let's say I'm very stubborn and I say, you know what? No, I'm a married bachelor. I don't care what you say.
Right.
Now, what have I done? What I'm saying is that you have the concept of being married, which means that you are not a bachelor, and the concept of being a bachelor, which means you're not married, and you're saying they happen at the same time. This is a logical contradiction.
Right.
This is what we call mutual exclusivity. I cannot be Fahad and not Fahad at the same time. That's the principle. If I ask you to prove the principle, you cannot. You start with the logical principle and move forward, right? And so logical principles are part of the fitrah. Aesthetic tastes, like let's say my wife and I would go out, we see a sunset, and I say, honey, that's beautiful, and she says, that is the ugliest thing I've ever seen. Prove to me rationally that's beautiful. Right? You can't go anywhere, right?
That conversation.
Yeah, khalas, it's over, right? So aesthetic taste, logical principles, smells. When you smell something, imagine you walk into a room and you say, man, something really stinks. And your friend walks in and says, oh, that smells beautiful, man. Just take it all in, bro. You're just like, how do you prove what? So, and the interesting thing is that these are things that lie outside of rationality. Okay. Right. And you cannot prove them, but you accept them and you move forward. Right. And that is
before you move on, because I think it's something that's really gonna kind of, those coming to my mind too. But I have this question here from our president. So right now we've established that there are first principles for every paradigm. So you have it for Islam, you have it for secularism. So before we actually get into the first principles, and I'm not sure if we'll have time for that, if you can briefly explain, why do Islam's first principles, why do they get preference? Why should I automatically take Islam first principles and say, I'm going to stick with, as opposed to another paradigm?
So here's the thing. If we assume that there are, because first principles, and this is what I was getting at, is that you cannot prove them, right? That's one of the nature of the first principles, right? That they're not, and so the first point is to accept that there are things that you cannot prove, all right? Once we come to that station to say, okay, are there things that we cannot prove? Then we have to then move on to say, okay, let's take the idea of the existence of God or the existence of a creator. Okay. If I asked you to prove, let's say, prior creative processes, that's not something that you need to prove per se. So if I had this Captain America painting behind me, right? Now you assume that there was an artist who painted it and put it together. Okay. Now, if I said that that's a self-evident truth, meaning that there is a cause and an effect, and there are prior creative processes, and this is not something that you prove, okay? So when we talk about self-evident truths, we say that there's certain characteristics by which you recognize those self-evident truths. So for example, one of the ways you recognize a self-evident truth is by understanding that it is something that gives you a coherent worldview. That if you believe something else, it's a more complicated and difficult explanation, which breaks down your worldview. That's one characteristic. Another characteristic is that that it is untaught. So it's, and so therefore no one sits you down and teaches you that things have prior creative processes, right? So and that there's a painting, and then that necessarily that there was a result, and that there was a cause of that painting. You don't have to sit down and learn that from somewhere, right? That's just internal within inside of you. And the third is that it is intuitive. meaning it is something that is cross-cultural. It's not something that's limited to one culture or another. Okay, so to give you just a different example of a self-evident truth, the fact that the past is real. Imagine someone comes to you and says, Sheikh Hamza, I have something I need to tell you. You know, the past, it's not real. Okay, so now, so what is the appropriate approach to take? Is it
Right.
upon you to prove to this person that the past is real,
Right.
or for them to prove to you that the past is not real?
Right.
Right. The appropriate position.
Who does it lie on? Right.
Right. So who has the burden of proof? Right. So if that's the case, the past being real, number one, it's intuitive, it's cross-cultural, right? It's universal in a sense. Not that everyone agrees upon it, but it's not that it's limited to being an American that you believe the past is real, but in Australia, they have a difference of opinion. It doesn't work like that. No matter what culture you're in, you believe the past is real. Okay. Does it give you does it give you coherence in your worldview? Of course, if you start believing the past is not real, then your worldview starts to break down. Did the memories I had 5 minutes ago, were they real? Right? So then your worldview breaks down. And no one sits you down and teaches you that. No one, it's not like when I was 5 years old, my mother sat me down and said, Fahad beta, you know, the past, what happened 5 minutes ago, that was real. Right?
Yeah. Right.
So these are what we call self-evident truths. And when we come to the Islamic framework, we find that the characteristics of the existence of Allah, right, the existence of a creator, right, when we talk to prior creative processes, is part of those self-evident truths, right? And if someone wants to negate that, they are the ones that they have the burden of proof, not the one that believes in a creator.
Right.
Does that make sense? I hope I'm not.
I think that's the best anyone can do in 5 minutes. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Take the course.
Inshallah. So just to summarize, the summary is that if you want to challenge Islam's self-evident truths and you want to come and say something to the opposite, the burden of proof is upon you to bring forth and to show this is why you can't believe in this or this is why this does not make sense. So moving on, Sheikh. So we kind of talked a little bit about the categories of doubts, the sources of doubts. So practically speaking, when you have a doubt, right? You're dealing with something that's troubling you, whether it's philosophical, or it's scientific or personal. I want you to shed light on kind of two aspects. One is that what's kind of a to-do list that you would give, especially to younger people and older people as well. You're going through something. What should you do? And similarly, what are the common mistakes that people make once there's a doubt lingering around? If you can kind of shed light on both those.
Sure. I mean, to be really honest, the course that we put together with the 10 steps, the reason why we put 10 steps together is because it's going to depend on the type of doubt that you're facing, right? And where you are in that doubt. Okay. Because certain doubts you could be in where you are teeter-tottering on leaving Islam. All right. That's a different doubt than, let's say, a certain issue that you recently found out, and that's saying like, wait a minute, that doesn't really make sense to me, right? So you have kind of this spectrum of doubt upon which you could be on, right? So let's take the kind of the tail end, teeter-tottering on like leaving Islam. Let's say that's where you're at. If that's where you're at, then it becomes important for you to basically take a step back and start to now, first of all, put yourself in the openness that Islam could be true. Okay, when I'm saying that is standing in the possibility of the truth of Islam. Because if you're at that point, a lot of times it's not about where the arguments are, but it's about where your ego might be, right? And I'm just going to be blunt when I say this. Sometimes when you're at that point, it's like, I already know, I've already come to the conclusion that Islam is not true, and here are the ways I'm going to prove it. Now, if that's something that someone's concerned about, you need to take a step back and say, let me at least stand in the possibility that Islam is true, right? Once you stand in that possibility, then you can now approach the various sources within the Islamic framework, okay? So whether that means studying the specific issue that's causing you a doubt, right? Whether it's the age of Aisha, whether it's homosexuality, transgenderism, scientific, whatever it might be. Right. But the first step would be to understand that what is your predisposition? What sort of weight does it carry? Okay. Because your predisposition is probably carries more weight than the specific issue that caused you doubt in the first place. Right. And we know this, like the people that didn't accept Islam historically, it wasn't because there was some sort of rational issue per se. Right. Abu Jahl. It wasn't that Abu Jahl was, that he had some sort of rational issue with the prophethood of the Prophet ﷺ. In fact, when they went to Abu Jahl and they spoke about the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't mention like, oh, I don't believe he's a prophet. He mentioned, hold on a second, he's from, Banu Hashim, right? And we are from Banu Makhzum, and we've always had this competition in our tribes, and they're saying they have a prophet and we don't have a prophet. I will never accept him.
Yeah.
Nothing to do with that. It had to do with ego, right? And even before that, Shaitan, the quintessential example, right? Yeah. Talk about knowledge. He's seen everything. He's gotten more knowledge than many of us, right? All of us, perhaps. And yet it had to do with, so the first step is to take a step back and say, where's my ego in all of this? And am I going to stand in the possibility that Islam is true? Okay. Now that's on one end of the spectrum.
Okay.
If we go to the other end of the spectrum.
Just to summarize, to reconsider that what you're thinking, that to reevaluate what you've kind of already come to a conclusion, to reevaluate that's the first step.
Yes. And remember when I was saying that Islam, the way you come to certainty is by rationality and spirituality.
Right.
So dealing with your ego is a spiritual issue, right? And it's the thing that's going to cut you off before a rational argument. Right. And that's why I was saying that in order for you to reach certainty, you need to actually combine both. Right. So that's on one end of the spectrum. If we look at the other end of the spectrum, let's say you have certain questions, then you take the approaches to deal with those questions, right? So one of those approaches is to study the specific issue, to find someone that would know about that specific issue, assuming that Islam is true, right? Because remember, one of the things about Islam and its truthfulness is that it gives you a coherent worldview. Anything outside of Islam, you're going to find major problems philosophically, right? Philosophically, morally, socially, economically, and we can go on. So if you're on that end of the spectrum where, okay, I'm not really sure about that. How do I reconcile, a person marrying a 9-year-old, right? The assumption is if that's really the only issue you're having, then your faith is pretty solid, but it's giving you some doubt. Go to the issue and explore the issue. And again, be open to the possibility, right? And, the age of Aisha, just that specific example, we talk about that in the course and kind of deconstruct that from beginning to end. We talk about, the idea of presentism, how we have ethnocentric biases that we project back. And we assume that current, subjective morals are trans-historic. In other words, whatever's true today was true yesterday, right? And so on, which becomes a problem.
A lot with slavery. It goes for a lot of the questions that our worldview is the only worldview, or that's how it's always been.
Right. And remember, I was saying that what Islam does is that it gives you a coherent worldview. Because, look, if we talk about, just to take a foray into morals, right? If we assume certain morals are objective, and what I mean by objective is that they're not subject to human mind and limitations, right? So if I ask the question, is it okay to behead a 3-year-old? All right. You say no. All right. Is that objectively immoral, or is that just your subjective opinion? Well, no. You would say that is objectively immoral. It doesn't matter what time, what place, where you are, who you are. It doesn't matter. Okay. If that's objectively immoral, why is it objectively immoral? If you don't have a belief in a transcendent being, in other words, God or Allah, then you cannot make a claim that any moral is objective. It has to be subject to either your opinion, or subject to biology, or subject to society. And, society, the quintessential example of how that goes wrong is, Germany and Hitler, right? If you say that all morals are subjective. Yeah. So objective morality, you must have a belief in a creator, right? And so I was speaking about Islam giving you a coherent worldview. You start with that understanding, and you study the specific issue. And that's kind of the spectrum. And obviously there's places within that spectrum you would deal with. So
I think you summarized that in a great way, Sheikh. Okay, so we'll just take a couple of questions that I think are related. So this is an interesting one. So why is it that people redirect their doubts of Muslim figures, Muslim governments, and leaders to doubts of the religion? Why do people link those two together?
Well, I to be honest, I don't really blame them, right?
Yeah,
Because at the end of the day, you're saying, what are the fruits of Islam,
right,
right? And so, it can be very easy to say, like, look, if this is the leadership of the Muslims, then what can we say about, what's the basis of what they're upon, right?
right,
But the important thing in that particular instance is to understand that you have a religion that gives you a coherent worldview that's stable, right? And that because of the fact you have human beings, and human beings are going to have weaknesses and limitations. And so, because human limitations are just that, human limitations, you can't judge a system that's put forth that claims a link to the divine with a being that has limitations, right?
right,
So it's just once that's kind of disconnected, we kind of understand that. But I wouldn't necessarily blame someone, because
right,
again, one of the ways that we fortify our faith is that we think about the remarkable heroes in our tradition and so on and so forth, right? But again, it becomes important to kind of de-link that, because again, human beings are limited, and the only one that's not limited is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? We always talk about,
good
yes.
way to put that is that you can say that there is no system whose followers, whose believers are all going to be in sync. There's always going to be a group of the followers that are not following the system, that are not representing it in its best way. I mean, I don't think there's
Yeah,
any,
no, of course. And what's really interesting, and sometimes I tell people this, I said, look, what is the alternative then? Let's say you have a system outside of Islam. Are you going to look at democracy, secularism? There's an interesting, a lot of interesting work in academia, and they look at the very idea of liberalism itself as a philosophy. And a lot of thinkers, a lot of philosophers have come to the conclusion that there's never been an absolute example of a perfect liberal state. There's always defects in that utopian ideal. So there's never been a practical application of liberalism at its philosophized perfection. Whereas within the Islamic framework, you actually do have an example of that. You have the time of the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr and Umar and so on and so forth, right? So on one hand, you at least have an example of actualization, whereas any other system, whether you're looking at communism, democracy, any other ism, feminism, right, whatever it is,
right,
there really hasn't been an actualization of that.
right.
So
Yeah, so I think the key thing is to the 2 points to take away are one is to I think you put it in a very good way. One is to understand that humans are weak, and by their nature, they will not always be in sync with the system or follow the system. That's the first thing. And second thing is, what's the alternative? Every system has a similar pattern that you can find, but Islam is unique, and that we have something, a model that others do not have.
Hamzah, he says something some time ago, and I thought it was really, really powerful. He says, look, he said, just remember, kufr will always contradict itself.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
the nature, right? It's falsehood. It'll always, and you might not see it immediately, but understand that it will always contradict itself by its nature. So
Yeah. Okay, so this is a fairly easier one, I think. What point did you stop searching for answers to specific doubt? When should you stop looking for more answers?
well, again, it's going to depend on the type of doubt, right? If it's causing a doubt in the fundamentals of your faith, then at a certain point, you have to leave it alone. And the problem is that, again, going back to this whole idea of being able to prove everything, we have to understand that there are certain limitations that we have as human beings.
Right.
If we're willing to accept that we have limitations within our eyesight, right? Our ocular distance is limited. Like, I cannot see what's in the other room, right? I cannot hear what's going on down the street. Similarly, our cognitive faculties have limitations as well. It is by the very idea that we are created beings and only Allah has perfection, right? And we're going to, by necessity, have limitations. So if there are doubts that are causing you to have doubts in your faith, it comes back down to coming back to reassessing the fundamentals of your religion itself, right? Because those are strong. Just because there's a doubt that's lingering, it doesn't negate the entire gamut of the Islamic tradition.
All right. Okay. So quick, some of more. So this is kind of a follow up from the previous one. So how do you separate the actions of an isolated group, like acts of Islamic terrorism, from the social image of Islam? And I'll just add on here. At what point do the adherents or the followers of a certain system they continue to do something that goes against the actual principles? But generally, humanity simply they cannot separate it anymore because it's become a part and parcel of it.
So, I mean, look, when it comes to specifically terrorism and acts of terrorism, what we have to understand from one perspective, and I know this might sound really strange, from one perspective, it is actually a support of some of the foundations of your faith. I know that might sound strange because this is not a new issue, right? In fact, its starting point was during the time of the Prophet ﷺ himself, right? Where those that the Prophet ﷺ specifically informed us about characteristics about people who will go to extremes, right? And so it's not like we have no idea and it's just a surprise, right? We knew that that's the case, right? That they have certain qualities, certain characteristics. So now, if you say that those groups are overwhelming, I would probably contend that as well, because is it that the majority of the Muslim ummah, that as we know it today, are falling under terrorism? Well, you'd have to say a categorical no, because just logically, if that was the case, you'd have a very unstable world, right? Sometimes when I'm having, like when we do like presentations at churches, and I always tell people, because I live in Texas, so people are very kind of raw, right? And I always tell them to be as raw as you can. And so you have some of these people come up and like, hey man, why y'all killing the people, right? And I said, look, man, if it was part and parcel of my faith to just kill you because you're not a Muslim, then we wouldn't be having this conversation. Right off the bat, I wouldn't be here talking to you, So, I think what happens is that, again, as human beings, we are influenced. And by the way, this is one of the 10 strategies is understanding the power of influence, right? That you are influenced by the social media, your friends, the community around you. And so it becomes, in order to kind of do away with that, you need to find other areas of influence and understand what is reality, right? So again, separating the actions, the question is, how do we separate the actions of an Islamic, an isolated group like the acts of Islamic terrorism from the social image of Islam? Well, I mean, it's upon you to do that separation. And again, like I said, when it comes to terrorism, sometimes I tell people, I say, it's actually something that testifies to the truthfulness of the Prophet ﷺ, as opposed to, like someone once asked, they said, oh, like, what do you think about all these groups? You have the Shia and the 12 Shias and the Sunnis and this and that. And I said, Sadaqa Rasulullah ﷺ, right? Because the Prophet ﷺ said that this ummah would divide into groups, right? And yet gave us the steps by which to what to do and what to follow and how to move forward, right? So from a certain perspective, you could say, yeah, that's could cause a doubt. From another perspective, it could lead you to a higher level of certainty, and Allah knows best.
Allah knows best. Sheikh, two kind of questions will sneak in because we're kind of short on time. One is that, in particular, there's the sets of doubts or questions that people have that conflict with, for example, science, or it seems to contradict. But then there's those which are strictly within the Islamic framework, and they have nothing to do with other paradigms. So, for example, in my kind of WhatsApp, I have two questions right now that I was in the middle of responding. One is about the authority of the Sunnah of the Prophet, right? Why is the Prophet's hadith, why is the Quran not enough? Very commonly asked question. And the second one is, someone who's dealing with someone in their college who is from a Shi'i background, and so they have the concept of the 12 Imams, and so he's not understanding. So what would you advise people who have doubts or questions that are internal within the Islamic framework and not dealing with any other framework? How should they go about handling those in particular, especially for an Orthodox Sunni Muslim?
Sure. So I'm going to be really blunt and say that you need to study your religion, basically. Right? A lot of times we rely on heuristics. Like I mentioned, we want shortcuts to understand a worldview, and we want a quick and easy answer, right? a lot of times it's not going to be a quick and easy answer. When it
Yeah.
comes to the authority of the sunnah, it's multi-layered and multi-leveled, right? I mean, from one perspective, there's a logical perspective of that, like how do you apply the sunnah and so on and so forth. But there's a number of other layers as well, right? Starting from the Quran itself, like what the Quran says about the Prophet ﷺ. What was the role of the Prophet ﷺ? How do we reconcile the role of the Prophet ﷺ in the worldview that we have today? Again, comparing it to the alternative. If we disconnect the sunnah from the Quran, then what is the alternative and what does that lead you to, right? Because then you're into a whole range of other issues when you're dealing with things outside the Islamic framework, right? So I'm gonna, and this is a section we actually cover as one of the strategies, one of the 10 strategies is to study Islam. It becomes imperative that we are not just people who are, that we're not superficial in our approach. Because one of the things that we're encouraged to do is seek knowledge, right? Over and over again in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is prompting us to do that. And the Prophet ﷺ has given us so many fadail of talab al-ilm, right? Of seeking knowledge, that it's fard upon us, male or female. So a lot of those issues, especially when it comes to, intra-religious issues, it becomes a matter of digging down, actually studying the religion itself. Something like studying usulul hadith, I think is extremely important, right? Both intra-religious and extra-religious, because this is the issue, by the way, of hadith isn't just an intra-religious issue. Even within Western academia, there's a lot of knocking of hadith. And so you could be sitting in a class in college, let's say on Islam 101, and the professor could completely negate hadith. And if you're not equipped to deal with that, that could lead into a lot of trouble.
I think a good example to that, one of my teachers, he told me actually when I was studying, is that someone who actually had doubts with the sunnah, he told him, he said, listen, have you actually ever studied even a basic matan, a primer in usul hadith, the principles of hadith? And so he said, no. He said, well, why don't you start coming to my class? So he said, by the time he finished the class, his doubt was gone because he realized there is an actual system there to verify, with the rijal, with the narrators itself, matan criticism itself. So there's much more than what it seems like. You just hear that it's hearsay. Somebody said the Prophet said. So
and even the concept of it being hearsay, which is totally, I agree with that 100%. That once you study the subject in detail, those is where you'll get enlightened, right? That's where you get the concept of understanding things at a deeper level. But even when it comes to hadith and the concept of testimony itself, one of the things that we teach is that you cannot do away with the concept of testimony. Most of your knowledge comes from testimony. If I asked anybody, I said, prove to me the world is round without testimony, without information from the say-so of others, you can't do it. Unless you're, a part of Elon Musk's team who went out to outer space and you've actually seen the earth yourself, you are by necessity relying upon, and most of your knowledge, whether it's knowledge of evolution, whatever it's knowledge of, it's based upon testimony. So if that's the case, if testimony is fundamental to how we know things, the fact that the Islamic framework has a robust system of testimony that's unlike anything else, even Western academia does not have a system that robust, So, and once you study that system, it clarifies all of that. Inshallah.
Definitely agree with that. So last question we'll take here, Sheikh. Talking about, so you mentioned others supporting transgender and LGBTQ based on assumptions that can't be proved. Can you expand more on what to say to those Muslims who say that Allah does not create people imperfect? And there's more to it. So, and that they know they are the other gender inside. Keep in mind, there are Muslims who fall under this category. Essentially, saying that Allah does not create people imperfect. How do you, deal with that?
So there's a couple of things to understand about at least the transgender issue, right? One issue is that sometimes we confuse what we mean by transgender. Okay, what we're specifically speaking about here is someone that is biologically born as one either a male or a female, and then feels somehow that they are not that. They're the opposite, right? If they're born with biological features of a male, they feel they're female, or vice versa. Okay. Now, aside from when we talk about that those are assumptions that can't be proved, one of the issues that arises is that how does one know that they are the other gender?
Right.
Like, how would you, is that society that defines that? And if it's society that defines that, then you run into another issue that a lot of modern feminists don't like, because feminists would say that these gender roles are only based on what society tells us, and they're not real in any sense, right? And so, because the only reason that girls play with dolls and boys play with GI Joes or whatever boys play with nowadays, right, video games, whatever it is, right, is because of society. And so society is not a real measure of whether you're a male or a female, whether you're a boy or a girl or a man or a woman. The issue that arises is that if we can't use society as a means to tell us whether we're a male or a female, whether we're a man or a woman, then how would a person know that they're male or female, right?
Right.
Outside of biology. So if you've
Right.
taken out biology, you've taken out society, then how do you substantiate that?
Right.
So before we knock this idea that Allah does not create something, that's different or unnatural, whatever it might be, before we knock Allah, first of all, it's okay, then how do we know that? Like, what is the basis by which we can say that, okay, I feel like a woman? If I can't measure that with society and I can't measure that by biology, how do I know that?
Right. So to summarize, there has to be some source. There have to be some reason behind you, seeing that it has to either be science or society or biology. But there's nothing, if you're willing to concede to nothing, then,
Right. There has to be some sort of objective standard, right? If it's just subjective, then there's no sort of reality to it. And so before the idea of saying, okay, well, Allah would not create someone in that sort of situation, but how do we define that situation? Like, how do you know that that is the reality of the situation you're in, right? If you're not going to accept biology, you're not going to accept society, what objective standard would you accept?
Jazakallahu khairan, Sheikh. We are past our time. Alhamdulillah, great discussing with you. So just on the, I know you touched a bit on gender roles, on these kind of issues, on LGBTQ. We'll have, inshallah ta'ala, other speakers, and we'll go into each of these issues, and we'll have more time to kind of talk about that. I want to thank Sheikh Fahad for joining us. I know he's a very busy man, and inshallah,
my pleasure.
I know you visited us before as well. And so, alhamdulillah, it's nice to have you virtually. For those tuning in, there's a request for the Cape Girardeau Islamic Center. Their masjid was burned down in a horrible accident, or incident, actually, was done on purpose. And so we hope that you can help, inshallah, raise some money for them. They are quite short of their goal. Go to their website, inshallah, and make a small donation, whatever you can. Inshallah ta'ala, it'll be sadaqah jariyah. Jazakallah khairan to everyone for tuning in, inshallah. This is a monthly series, so we'll be back, inshallah, December. And the last Saturday of December, inshallah, with a different speaker. So stay tuned, and jazakumullah khairan to the viewers and Shaykh Fahad.
Jazakallah khair. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you and bless all of the viewers. Just as a concluding remark, the masjid that you mentioned, if you're hearing about the masjid, you saw the website, don't let time pass by. If you can donate $10, $5, whatever it is you can, go to the website and donate now. Don't let shaitan come between you and this potential means to enter Jannah. It could be the thing that takes you to Jannah, and just do it now, inshallah. So I'm just going to say that. And one last attempt at my shameless plug: go to sapiens.org and check out the No Doubt course. It's with myself, Hamzah Imtiaz, and Dr. Uthman Latif, and it gets into a lot more details with some of the stuff we spoke about. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless everyone. If there's something that was said that was incorrect, or that was offensive to anyone, then I seek your forgiveness for that. All of the goodness comes from Allah, and any of the faults are my own. So jazakumullah khair. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you.
Jazakumullah khairan. Make sure you all follow Sapiens Institute, as well as Sheikh Fahad. He's on Instagram, I believe, as well as on Facebook. Inshallah, benefit from him. And jazakumullah khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.